Parks. Thankfully, Edinburgh has a lot of them. Whether you're taking a shortcut to work, relaxing in the sun, or meeting your wheat dealer, parks play an important part in everybody's life. Parks are important places, and I think we downplay that fact. They're important for our mental, physical, and environmental health. But we're here to talk about their history, so enough talk. Let's talk about Edinburgh's parks.
Spring is here, spring is here.
Okay, so the first park we're going to talk about is by far the most physically obvious one. The one that you can literally see from space. Like, seriously, you cannot miss this one. We're talking about Arthur's Seat. Arthur's Seat is one of my favourite parts because you can literally walk into the centre and you can be free of all sound and almost fool yourself into thinking that you are in the Highlands. Now, I'm going to say the obvious thing that everyone knows about Arthur's Seat. It is part of a dead volcano. A lot of Edinburgh's parks in the city centre are part of that volcanic landscape in one way or another, and this saved it from development. You can't build anything here, unlike with Castle Rock, which is roughly minnow-shaped, but that didn't stop people living here. Arthur's Seat is home to not one, but 4 hill forts, thought to have belonged to the Beltane. From the Bronze to Iron Ages, hills were brilliant places to set up settlements simply for security. Signs of agriculture from this time can still be seen on this hill from time to time, weather permitting. Where the origin of it as a park came from was with its links to Holyrood Abbey and the palace. This big highland-like landscape right next to the palace was the perfect place for hunting and later as a pleasure ground for royals from David I to Victoria. In fact, the founding of the abbey is said to have resulted from this park. According to legend, David I, while he was out hunting, encountered a stag, and whilst he was chasing the stag, he fell from his horse. He was about to be gored when, according to him, he saw a vision of a cross appearing between the stag's antlers, and miraculously the stag turned away. He saw this as an act of divine intervention, and in thanks, he founded the abbey on the site of this encounter, which is what gave the park its name, which is Scots for Holy Cross. This eventually gave rise to Holyrood Palace in the 1500s, which is still today an occasional royal residence. Now, I have already spoken about the Radical Road in a previous video, but there is one thing I haven't spoken about, and it just so happens to be the dolls. You don't know about the dolls? I think it's time we spoke about the dolls. So, in 1836, a group of boys exploring Arthur's Seat came across a collection of homemade dolls in coffins in a cave on Arthur's Seat. Some of them were clothed in scraps of cloth and some of them remained unclothed, and they were all apparently placed on a makeshift shelf in the cave. All of this sounds like a ghost story, but they were very real and can be seen in the National Museum of Scotland to this day, and I have to say, they are nightmare fuel. The purpose of these dolls are unknown. One popular theory that they were made as a form of witchcraft in relation to the Burke and Hare murders. People noted that the amount of coffins and dolls correspond with the murders carried out by Burke and Hare, and perhaps someone of a witchy persuasion made the dolls in the coffin to try put their spirits to rest. Either way, we do not know who made these coffins or why, but it's one of the coolest and creepiest stories I know. Now, Arthur's Seat is full of very interesting features that include, but are not limited to, St Anthony's Chapel. But when you look at an 1892 OS map, you see a lot more interesting features, like the shooting range in the valley around Hunter's Bog. Yes, there used to be a shooting range here, complete with powder stores and targets. You can most clearly see them on the 1892 map, but they appear on maps right up until the Second World War. All of this sounds rather concerning how popular this walk is, that at one point you risk getting shot, but I guess it's as good a place as any to practice shooting as anywhere else in the city. There's still a range for the army up in the Penland Hills, by the way, up near Castle Hill Fort, so be careful in the hills and look out for red flags. Another thing you might be surprised at is somebody once proposed building a canal round the edge. When the Union Canal was but a glimmer in some late Georgian engineer's eye, there were several proposals for a canal, and a lot of them took the route down to Leith because, you know, that's where all the ships were. You'll find that this is not the only time someone proposed putting a canal through a park.
All the world seems into.
The thing people keep talking about when talking about Prince Street Gardens is the Nor Loch. Yes, Prince Street Gardens used to be a loch, and yes, it pretty much became the city sewer, but there's far more to the Nor Loch than just that. The Nor Loch was actually an artificial loch ordered by James III in 1460. There was a burn that drained into what was back then a marshy hollow, so the loch was formed by building an earthen dam which we today know as the Mound. All of this was done for defence because while the south side of the castle was perfectly defendable, the north side was a lot less defendable. So using the Nor Loch as a moat seemed appropriate. That was until the Earl of Wharton pointed out, during the Lang's siege nonetheless, that when the loch froze over, you could possibly take an army across. There's no evidence that I have found that this was ever done, but I'm surprised it took 111 years for someone to point that out. Now, another wee thing said about the Nor Loch is that it was used for witch ducking, wherein women were tested for witchcraft by seeing if they sank or floated in water. Now, the Scottish Survey of Witchcraft says that there's little evidence for this, but there is evidence for the use of drowning as an execution method. This was abolished in 1685, but one particularly gruesome account recalled a man and his two sisters being condemned to death by drowning, placed in a chest of holes in it and thrown into the loch. Some sources say that the younger sister had her sentence commuted, but until 1820 the story was seen pretty much as a myth. That was until they discovered a chest with 3 skeletons in it whilst digging a drainage ditch in 1820. Anyway, the loch was drained slowly over time, finally draining away by the early 19th century. The story of Prince Street Gardens is indeed very fascinating, and like a lot of things, it started with a council dispute. East Prince Street Gardens' origin story started in 1771 when the City Corporation, the council's predecessor, acquired the land for the new town development and started selling bits off to be developed. This pissed off the proprietor of the new town, who wanted the area to remain open for a vista of the old town. This was taken to court, and after a lengthy battle, an agreement was made, and the area, which is now East Prince Street Gardens, was kept as a pleasure grounds. Interestingly enough, the same agreement also dictated the design of what is now the Waverly Mall. See, part of the agreement stated that the parcel of land which now houses Waverly Mall must not have its buildings go above the level of Princess Street, which is why the Waverly Mall looks the way it does today. As for West Prince Street Gardens, its origins also emerged from council disputes. After the loch was drained, it became the private property of the proprietors of Princess Street, meaning it was like the gardens that you see in those posh areas that you can't enter. You know the areas I'm talking about, the places of all the posh offices and consulates? Well, West Prince Street Gardens was once like that, only bigger. In 1816, the gardens passed to the council and was operated to subscribers only at first. Yes, you heard me, you had to subscribe to use the park. This ended in 1821 when residents of the new town, regardless of who we were, could use the park. Now, the rules of the park were surprisingly strict. Dogs, the playing of cricket, smoking and prams were banned from the park, and if you wanted to use a bath chair, which was an early form of wheelchair, you needed to present the park officials with a doctor's note, and people talk about ableism today. Anyway, to great opposition, the park was converted into a public park in 1876 and was laid out by Robert Moorhen. It's quite interesting that today Prince Street Gardens are now an institution that, if touched up or changed in any way, will cause mass public outcry. The more things change, the more things stay the same, I guess. There was also the incident in 1949 where there was a proposal to demolish the existing buildings on Princess Street and build a motorway for the gardens, which was the first volley in the ossification of Edinburgh, which still affects Edinburgh today. Luckily, this plan didn't happen and was met with justified outcry, and if you know anything about induced demand in regards to roads, this would have resulted in worse traffic than we have now rather than less, but that's a rant for another video.
But they still go for peanuts when coated.
Castorfin Hill is the weird one. It's certainly popular with tourists for its views of the city, whilst being easier to climb than Arthur's Seat, but it's also very offbeat. Not every hill has a half-finished Parthenon on its peak, where on the day before May Day we hold a fire festival. Well, probably talk about that later. There was the possibility of a hill fort in Castorfin Hill, meaning Edinburgh city centre basically had multiple hill forts, which I would imagine would have been a bit like this.
Hello? Yes, what? What?
You really want to know?
Yes!
You!
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 No! You!
But anyway, evidence shows that in prehistoric times it was used as a quarry. In 1456, James II granted the community of Edinburgh the valley and low ground between Castorfin Hill and Greenside for the performing of tournaments, sports and other warlike deeds. But this area was also used as a theatre because at the time it was a natural amphitheatre. Today it is now the site of Edinburgh Playhouse, so there are still plays being performed in the area to this day. The area was owned by the Logan family until 1609, when Robert Logan was posthumously charged with treason and the lands passed on to the Elphinston family. In 1729, they sold the western side of the hill to the borough of Edinburgh. I think we need to talk about the monument in Castorfin Hill because, well, you can't miss it. This is a national monument of Scotland and is a memorial to those who died in the Napoleonic Wars. It was meant to be a replica of the Parthenon in Athens, playing off the whole Athens of the North thing. But despite being started in 1826, by 1829 it had run out of money and was left unfinished, thus gaining its nickname, Edinburgh's Disgrace. A title that throughout the years got thrown into a plethora of other things because if Edinburgh's anything, it's melodramatic when a scandal happens. There have been several proposals to complete it, including as a monument to Queen Victoria, as a monument to the Act of Union, as an art gallery, which sort of happened to the Observatory anyway, as a Scottish Parliament building in 1908 of all years, and finally as a memorial to World War I, none of which ever came to pass, and I suspect any proposals of the sort would be shot down because today it's become a bit of an icon. Also, its pagan links as a half-finished Greek temple certainly plays a part in the Beltane festival, which occurs every year on the day before May Day. For those not in the know, Beltane happens on May the 1st, as it is the spring holiday from which May Day came from. I've been to the Beltane festival before, and it's certainly something I think more people should experience. It's dark, you're on top of a hill, and there's lots of fire, there are drums, and a good time is usually had by all. There's something very primal about greeting the coming of summer with ungodly amounts of fire on top of a hill. Anyway, the hill is also home to the Nelson Monument, which was built between 1807 and 1816 to commemorate Nelson's victory at Trafalgar, and contains a museum and a viewpoint on top of the tower, which is much easier to get up than, say, the Scott Monument. A lot less claustrophobic too. In 1853, a time ball was placed on the tower for the ships in Leith to set their chronometers to. On top of this, it was home to the City Observatory, which was built in 1776 and closed officially in 2009, which, considering light pollution and the construction of Blackford Hills Observatory, seems surprisingly late. It is now a contemporary art gallery and cafe, which seems more fitting considering that light pollution in Edinburgh city centre makes viewing the stars a rather steep task.
Someday you're free, why don't you come with...
Okay, so bear with me for a couple of seconds. The Meadows is the Mario to the Prince Street Gardens Wario. Yeah, hear me out. Both parks were the site of now drained lochs. But whereas the Borough Loch, which was the loch on the site of the Meadows, was the city's drinking supply, the Nor Loch on the site of Prince Street Gardens was basically the city's sewer. Whereas the Meadows, once drained, was turned into a common for the grazing of livestock and the playing of games, Prince Street Gardens was first the private gardens of people living on Prince Street, and then later a garden that you could only enter by subscription and you were not allowed to do anything but walk or vibe. Whereas the Meadows Festival is a community festival known for its small activist organisations, offbeat artsy types and general good vibes, the Christmas Festival is a hated, overpriced, heartless event which makes life hell for residents and generally leaves the park looking like a morass until spring. As I said, the Meadows was once a loch known as the Borough Loch, and before the reservoirs to the south of the city were built, it acted as the city's water supply. So generally the direction of water went from here to the Norloch via the citizens of the city. It was drained from the mid 17th century onwards until 1722, when Sir Thomas Hope drained the land completely to form parklands. It did in fact operate as a meadow and was used as grasslands to allow livestock to graze, hence its name. I don't know when this ended, but I think it would be interesting if somebody just brought their horse along to munch on some grass. This is where the meadows gained the link to Robert Burns when his father, William, worked on the park around 1749. The park has been threatened with development, namely in the 1830s as a grand cemetery and in the 1960s with an urban motorway, but thankfully neither of these things came to pass. The Meadows has been the site of several interesting events like the Edinburgh International Exhibition of 1886, for which a lot of things still remain today in and around the city, like the pillar at Nicholson Square Gardens or the Jawbone Arch still in the Meadows itself. The exhibition was massive, with a purpose-built exhibition hall being built in the Meadows. I touched upon one of the exhibits in another video, namely Caledonian Railways 123. It was back in the days when they built actual buildings for temporary exhibitions and demolished them afterwards. Anyway, another important event was the first ever Edinburgh derby between Hibs and Hearts on Christmas Day 1875. Yep, that would have been fun, playing football on Christmas Day. It's interesting to note, however, that Hibs was founded on the 6th of August that year, and Hearts was only founded the year before, meaning that even as little baby clubs, Hibs and Hearts were rivals. The Meadows was where Hibs played a lot of their games in the early days, considering that their headquarters was St Patrick's Church in the Cowgate. During the Second World War, the Meadows was turned over to food cultivation as part of the Dig for Victory campaign, and even after the war in the 50s, vegetable plots remained despite protests from the locals, and the last signs of food cultivation didn't disappear until 1966. Today, the Meadows is a nice park to take a shortcut on the way through town, but what if you wanted to go into the woods and become a forest goblin?
We've gained notoriety and caused much anxiety.
Gestorfin Hill is the odd one out because technically it's not a park, it's a local nature reserve, which is basically council speak for local woodland area. But you know what, I don't care. Let me remind you that I spoke about Arthur's Seat, and what is Arthur's Seat but not a mini mountain range transplanted into the middle of Edinburgh? So yeah, we're talking about Castorfin Hill. Castorfin Hill is interesting because in reality it's a collection of former estates, which you'll notice by all the rhododendrons. Fun fact, if you ever watch a scene set in a medieval forest, look out for the rhododendrons because they only came to the UK in the 19th century. Anyway, there is evidence of an ancient settlement in Castorfin Hill, a hill fort perhaps, and it doesn't seem to have been a particularly insignificant one either, with all the cut-marked stone art being found along with pottery, stone tools and shells. Maybe a proto-Castorfin? Ancient settlements seem to be a big fan of high places, which I guess makes sense for security reasons. Anyway, Castorfin Hill makes an appearance in Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. We came the byway over the hill of Castorfin, and when we got near the place called the Rest and Be Thankful, we looked down on Castorfin bogs and over to the city and the castle on the hill, and we both stopped, for we both knew without a word that we had come to where our ways parted. You can still visit the Rest and Be Thankful today, and it's a good place to look out over the city broodingly like some Edinburgh-based Batman. Now, Castorfin Hill basically started out as a series of landed estates, which you can clearly see on this map from the 1890s. We have Castorfin Hill House, which is today Edinburgh Zoo, Clarewood and Hillwood. Both houses are closed to the public, but Hillwood's walled garden is now a community garden open to the public. There's also Clermison Tower, a folly built in 1872 to mark the centenary of Sir Walter Scott's birth, and it was presented to the city in 1932. It is sometimes open to the public on open days, so you can go and climb up it, but I don't think I've ever been here when it's been open. Oh, and did I mention there's a nuclear bunker on Castorfin Hill? So in what was Barton Mount Quarry, there is a nuclear bunker, originally built in the 1950s as a way of tracking planes in case of a Soviet attack, but it was later assigned in the 1960s as the regional seat of government, aka where all the bigwigs in Scotland would go if the Cold War went hot. Now, I have been down it, and it is a really cool place, and it's recently got approval from the council to be turned into a museum, so it will hopefully be open more regularly now. However, when I was there last, one of the people there told me that the Soviets knew that the bunker was there and had targeted 2 nukes on it as a bunker buster if the Cold War ever went hot, which would have destroyed whoever was in the bunker. I don't know if this was before or after an anarchist group revealed its location in a zine made in the 1980s, but there we go. So yeah, whether you want to perform dark arcane rituals or run in the woods and never be seen from again, Edinburgh's parks have a lot to offer. Except ironically, Edinburgh Park, which despite being called that is not actually a park but a posh business estate. The only thing of note there is a Greggs. Whatever you do not go to Edinburgh Park. They don't even let you feed the ducks. Those poor, lovable ducks.